Hi, this is Victor Chang, author of Case Interview Secrets and founder of caseinterview.com. Today, I'm going to teach you the basics of a case interview, what it is, how they are different from regular job interviews, who uses them, why they're used at all, as well as the types of case interview formats and examples of various case interview questions. First, let's start with what is a case interview? A case interview is a hypothetical business situation that is presented during an interview process to determine how a candidate thinks about a particular problem and how they would solve it. It's intended to simulate life on the job as a management consultant. And what it does is it really replicates the stages of a 3 to 6 month client engagement in just 30 or 40 minutes. Candidates are presented with a problem that a client would typically face and are asked to solve the problem as if the interviewer was the client. Case interviews are not only used by management consulting firms, but also for jobs in Fortune 500 companies where strategic planning and complex decision-making are part of the role, such as in an internal strategy consulting group within a Fortune 500 company. So let's talk about what are the differences between a case interview and a regular job interview. Regular job interviews focus on resume experience. What did you do at your most recent job experience? What did you do before that? Help me understand where you went to school. What did you learn from those particular experiences? That kind of a thing. Case interviews are quite different. They don't really talk about the resume at all, at least during the case interview portion of an interview, which often is the majority of early stage interviews for management consulting jobs. Case interviews are a simulation of the actual client work. So it's really a simulation-based interview rather than a historical experience-based interview. And what you want to do is you want to think of the interviewer really as the client. That's the key to solving a case interview. So let's talk about who uses a case interview and why they use it. Case interviews are used by strategy management consulting firms to assess the problem-solving and analytical capabilities of a candidate before hiring them. The basic purpose of the case interview is to see if candidates can tackle real-life business situations effectively. Case interviewers look for 3 specific skills. The first is an analytical, repeatable problem-solving process. The second is the ability to generate provable, data-driven conclusions. Here's the reason why. Clients have lots of opinions. What they want is some kind of plan that they can justify to the board of directors, that the board of directors can justify to shareholders on Wall Street. So the key is anything you recommend, every conclusion you draw, every decision that is made needs to be defensible based on factual data. This is why Fortune 500 companies and Global 2000 companies will hire consulting firms. The third skill is interpersonal skills. I've always said that consulting is very much a relationship-based business. And what interviewers want to know is how would you come across to a client? The easiest way to do this is to simply imagine the interviewer is actually the client. So can you imagine if you were to talk to a client, what would you say? Say those same things to the interviewer. If there are certain things you would never say to the client, then don't say those things to the interviewer. So, for example, if you made a small mistake and you catch it, you would never say to the client, "Oh, I'm such an idiot. Why did I do that?" But you might be tempted to say that in front of an interviewer. Don't. Simply imagine how would you handle that in a professional setting. If it were me, I would say something like, "You know what? I think I made a small mistake on that. Let me rewind and say that in a different way," right? Very professional, acknowledging my mistake, not pretending to push a bad situation. So that kind of thoughtfulness is what interviewers are looking for. What would you say in front of a client? And more importantly, if I'm your manager, can I trust you to not embarrass me in front of a client? That's the question in the back of each interviewer's mind. Will you embarrass me if I put you in front of a client? So keep that in mind. Consulting firms are looking for 5 specific skills to be demonstrated by candidates in a case interview. These 5 skills include, first, problem structuring skills, and we'll talk more about that in a second. Second, logical reasoning. Third is analysis skills. The fourth is the ability to draw conclusions from data. And fifth is the ability to synthesize or really communicate your conclusion in a client-friendly kind of way. The first skill is problem structuring. Problem structuring simply refers to taking a very complex, overwhelming, and ambiguous problem and breaking it down into its component parts. That's more easy to manage. So let me give you 2 simple examples. if you have a client that's struggling with trying to increase profits for their company, which is a very common request made by Fortune 500 companies. Well, what are the components of profit? Well, there are two ways to increase profits are to increase sales or decrease costs, or both. So you would say a simple way to structure a profitability question would be to say, let's take this problem or this client engagement and break it into two component parts. First, we want to look at opportunities for increasing sales. Second, we want to look for opportunities to decrease costs. If we can do one or the other or both, we can therefore increase profits. So that's an example of structuring a complex problem. Let's say you have a company or a client that's looking to enter a new market. A very simplified, slightly oversimplified actually, approach to structuring this problem might simply be something like, well, you should enter the market if two conditions are true. First, if the external factors favor entering the market, that would be a vote in favor of entering that market. Second, if the internal factors within the company point to making entering that new market attractive, that would further support the conclusion to enter that new market. Right? That's a little oversimplified, but just wanted to give you the idea of what problem structuring sounds like. It's breaking a problem into its parts, where if each part points to a particular conclusion, you can be confident that the overall recommendation should be to do whatever you're recommending. So that's the key with problem structuring. And it's a very important skill because clients have a really hard time with this. They have a very hard time structuring complex problems. Should we do a mergers and acquisition? Should we invest $100 million to build a new factory? Should we sell off this particular division? Should we do layoffs? Is that better for us in the long run or worse? So there's a million questions clients have, a million headaches they have, and they really rely on consultants to do problem structuring. Second, we want to talk about logical reasoning. This is one of the vital skills consulting firms look for. First, you want to think out loud so the interviewer can see your thought process and your reasoning. One of the things interviewers are looking for is to trying to figure out if you are reasoning your way through a problem or if you're just guessing and just happen to get lucky. Second, as the case interview progresses, you will have many opportunities to ask questions and to request data about the client's situation. When you ask a question, you want to explain why you're asking the question. What are you hoping to get out of it? What answer are you looking for? And depending on the answer you receive, which direction are you inclined to go in the case situation? Next, as you shift gears and change between different parts of the case, again, you want to explain why you're shifting from one part to the other. For example, if you're trying to solve a profitability situation and you want to start with looking at revenues, explain why. And say, well, in the client description, they mentioned some concerns about revenues declining recently. I'd like to go explore that first, since that seems to be a recent change in situation, right? You have a reason. Maybe as you explore further, you realize that the decline in revenues really are out of the client's control. Maybe there's a recession. Maybe there's a regulatory change. So ideally, everything you do within a case, you do for a reason. And you should be prepared to explain what that reason is in case your interviewer asks. And I'd often would volunteer that reason, even if they don't ask, just to reassure them that there is a rationale behind everything that you're doing in the case. Third, case interviewers are looking for analysis skills. What interviewers want to see is your ability to assess data and address issues in a systematic way. The first thing to realize is that case questions are often based on actual client engagements. In many cases, the interviewer has spent 6 months or more looking at a particular client situation. So they have a lot of knowledge, basic background information, a lot of analysis, lots of data around sales, profitability, customer feedback, what competitors are doing. And it is expected that you ask questions about the client and the client's situation. Next, as you gather information about the client and their situation, you are expected to ask even deeper questions based on the things you learn. You want to look at your data and look for trends. Is the particular data you're requesting, is it increasing or decreasing? If the client is suffering from an issue with increased product defects, have the product defects been increasing or decreasing? What do product defects look like as a percentage of total number of units produced? How does it compare to other companies in the industry? So you're always not just gathering data, but you're also analyzing the data. And the way you analyze data is by comparing data to something else. And the two most common ways to compare data is to compare a particular metric with itself in a prior time period, or compare a particular metric with other companies of a similar size in a similar industry. So those are two very simple ways to analyze data and look for trends. And finally, you want to be able to draw conclusions from your data. So if you ask questions, which you're expected to, you get data from the interviewer, you expect it to be thoughtful about it, and eventually, as you gather enough data, a picture should form of what's going on with the client situation and should reveal in that process what the client should do about it. And so you want to be able to explain your conclusion and explain the rationale and what data you use to derive that particular conclusion. That goes to our fourth skill, which is drawing conclusions from data. So there's some specific things you want to be sure to do when you do this. The first is to realize that clients value fact-based conclusions based on data. They already have a team full of executives and board members and others that have plenty of opinions about what the company should do. What they need, though, is a factually derived conclusion that can be justified and supported. It's a way of unifying people with very different opinions if the data really clearly points to a particular direction. So that's why one of the reasons why these consulting firms really look for that in the case interview. Clients often bring in consulting firms because there's too many opinions going around the company as to what to do. So that becomes your role, and that also becomes your role during a case interview. And keep in mind, if you can't prove your conclusions, you just have another opinion, and that doesn't help the client. And that's why consulting firms look for those particular skills during the case interview. Finally, you want to be able to synthesize or communicate your conclusions in a really concise way. I often talk about this idea of speaking CEO, right? As if speaking to a CEO requires its own language. And in many ways it does. There's a certain way CEOs speak. There's a certain way you be influential with a member of the board of directors. And we call this synthesis, which is tying together lots of different thoughts and conclusions and data into just a cohesive story or a cohesive conclusion with a recommendation of what to do next. So the way you close out a case is through synthesis. And synthesis follows a very specific formula or pattern. The first thing you do when you synthesize a case is you state your conclusion and the recommended action. Right? Next, you explain 3 fact-based reasons that support your conclusion. And finally, you reiterate your conclusion and your recommended course of action. Those are the 3 key pieces to synthesizing a case. There are several different types of case interview formats. The specific format that you'll receive will vary based on the firm, the specific round of the interview, as well as which interview season that you're recruiting in. The firms are constantly in a state of flux in terms of changing which interview format they'll be using in any particular recruiting season or recruiting year. Keep in mind the thinking process, the analytical process, the communication process across all these different case interview types is actually the same. Whether you say a particular conclusion out loud or you write it down in a sentence or two, the process is very, very similar. So if you can get very good at the thinking and communication process, then the specific format of the case will be really irrelevant. So in some cases, your interviewer might give you data verbally. In other cases, they might do you the favor of writing down the data and just handing you a piece of paper with all the numbers so that you don't have to listen to it and write it down yourself. At the end of a case, you might be asked to give a verbal conclusion of what you want to do. In other case formats, they might ask you to write down your verbal conclusion, what would otherwise be your verbal conclusion, and just simply write it on a slide. So the process is identical, the words are identical, the questions you ask are identical, the data is identical. There just may be nuances in the delivery of data and how you're supposed to communicate your conclusions, which communication format they would prefer. So let's talk about the major types of case interview formats. And I've listed them primarily in the sort of popularity of these formats, with the first 2 by far the most popular. So the first format is the interviewer-led case interview. And this has been a trend over the last 10 years where more firms are using interviewer-led interviews. So let me explain what they look like. First of all, the interviewer-led case is very highly structured. The interviewer really guides and drives the process of the case. They control what part of the case you focus on. They control the sequence of what questions get asked or addressed and in what order. They control how much time you spend on each section, and they sequence the problem-solving steps. So they do a lot of the work that a engagement manager or a project manager would typically do on engagement. And then your role is to do specific pieces of work within the overall engagement. And you're expected to do that when you're told to, and you're expected to stop when they ask you to stop. So that's what an interviewer-led format looks like. And what it sounds like is the interviewer will describe a very large, complex problem. They might say, hey, this problem kind of breaks down into 3 or 4 or 5 parts. So they're kind of doing the problem structuring for you. And they'll ask you to say, hey, why don't you work on the first part? And here's a specific question I have in mind. And they might expect you to look at a chart. They might expect you to look at some data in a spreadsheet, or they might just give you some data verbally on which to do a particular analysis or a particular opportunity to ask additional questions to see what kinds of questions you come up with. Okay? The interviewer-led process is really driven by the interviewer because they ask you questions. The candidate-led interview, however, is quite different. The candidate-led process really involves you as the candidate leading the problem-solving process from beginning to end. So you are the quote-unquote project manager on the engagement, as well as the analyst or associate doing the actual analyses and work. In a candidate-led interview, you kind of want to treat the interviewer a lot like you would a client. You know, if you're a little unsure of what's permitted or what's permissible in the interview format, you're totally welcome to sort of call time out and ask the interviewer, hey, am I allowed to use a calculator or something like that? You know, those kinds of things. But otherwise, as you're presenting your findings, as you're asking questions, you want to ask as if they were the client themselves. Candidate-led cases are generally presented in a very general way. Your client is the CEO of a major global automobile manufacturer. Sales are down 30%. They ask you to help them. So that kind of a problem is given in a very generic way, and you as the quote-unquote project manager are expected to structure the case, break it up into its component parts, and then kind of be the analyst that sort of analyzes each of the parts. So that's what's a little bit different. So a candidate-led interview is less structured than an interviewer-led. In the interviewer-led case, the interviewer structures the case for you and gives you the 2, 3, or 4 parts. When you are leading the case as the candidate, you have to figure out the structure. You have to figure out if there are 2, 3, or 4 natural parts to the case, and you have to decide which part makes sense to start with. So it's a lot more open-ended. It definitely reflects what a live case or client engagement looks like, and it's an opportunity to demonstrate both a sort of analytical leadership skills as well as interpersonal skills because you're interacting with the interviewer as if they were the client. So again, big difference is the structuring. In an interviewer-led case, they structure the case for you, which makes it easier. In a candidate-led case, you structure the case and perform that particular function. Now, one of the trends I've been seeing over the last 10 years is that more firms are switching from the candidate-led case, which was much more popular over a decade ago, and increasingly more are using the interviewer-led process. So this will likely continue for the foreseeable future. And let me explain why this is happening. The problem with the candidate-led case is that most interviewers, because the candidate-led case requires so much data, they often use actual client engagements that they have worked on because they know the data so well. And the problem with that is that it's very inconsistent. So I'll give you an example. I had one particular interviewer years ago who worked in healthcare and gave me a case around health insurance. And the problem with health insurance is it is such a complicated industry that there are the people who use the service, there are the people who provide the service, and then there are insurance companies that pay for the service, but only some of the time. And there's all this jargon and terminology that's required to understand how healthcare works. And so I didn't do very well in that case because I spent half of the case just asking for definitions. You know, there aren't customers, there are patients. There aren't customers who pay for things, they are payors and they're payees and they're guarantors and guarantees, and so on and so forth. So becomes a very unfair comparison. So one of the trends I've been seeing is a lot of firms are switching more to the interviewer-led case. It's an easier case to solve because the interviewer gives you the structure and they lead you through it. So it is easier, but also harder to stand out because it's an easier case. So just want you to keep that in mind. The firms are constantly reevaluating which methodology they want to use every given recruiting season. So there will be some change in the next few years to come. A written case interview or a written portion of a case interview involves providing you with data in written format, or involves you communicating your findings in a written format. So let me explain what this looks like. If you ask for data in a traditional interviewer-led or candidate-led interview, the interviewer will tell you verbally, oh, sales are up or sales are down. In a written case or a part of a case that's provided in a written format, they'll instead hand you data from a spreadsheet or a table of data and values or a chart showing a particular trend for that particular metric that you asked for. So that's what it means, is you're receiving data in a written format. This is really helpful for you because you don't have to write things down and risk writing down incorrect numbers. From the interviewer standpoint and from the employer standpoint, one of the skills you're testing for in a written case interview or written portion of a case interview is your ability to interpret graphs and data. Can you look at a spreadsheet and understand what's significant about the data presented in the spreadsheet? Can you look at a chart for a particular metric like sales or costs or market share and notice interesting trends and patterns that stick out and that seem unusual to you? So that's an important skill that they're looking for when they provide you with data in a written format. The other times, they will ask you to communicate your findings in a written format. This might involve drawing a slide up, like a sort of a handwritten PowerPoint slide with your conclusions. Can you state your conclusion at the top of the slide? Can you provide 3 supporting bullet points to explain why your conclusion makes sense? So that's just taking a regular synthesis of a case that you would deliver orally and simply just writing down the exact same words. So that's just what that looks like. Don't be thrown by it. The process is the same. The words are the same. The calculations are the same. It's just a question of whether you're reading versus listening for data and whether you're verbally articulating or writing down your solutions and your recommendations. Over the years, some firms have experimented on a limited time basis with something called a group case interview. And what this does is it simulates 3 or 4 consultants working together to solve a particular case problem. Again, the case solving process is the same. It's the same data, it's the same questions, it's the same words for conclusions. What's different is how you interact with your teammates. Do you try to undermine them? Do you recognize a good idea that comes from somebody else? Are you polite and respectful, or are you trying to be ultra competitive and making somebody else look bad? So the group case really tries to see how you function in a team environment and if you can be a team player. So this process for solving the case is the same. There's a bit more debate between you and your colleagues as to what you want to do. And the key thing they're looking for that's different than a traditional one-on-one interview is, are you respectful of others? And if you disagree, can you disagree in a respectful and kind and politically gentle way? As if a client were to say something you disagree with, could you tell a client that you disagree in a way that doesn't offend them? Same idea. So this is all they're doing. They're just trying to simulate a different part of the job when they use this particular format. Finally, in a presentation-only case or a presentation-oriented case, a candidate is given a number of pieces of paper with charts and data, and they're expected to analyze that data, find a hypothesis, see if their hypothesis is correct, and analyze the data, and then present their findings. The candidate is expected to present their findings in a slideshow. They're given sort of blank slides and asked to write down some information that they want to convey in a final presentation. And here in this particular format, the emphasis is a lot more on the deliverables, right? So in an actual client engagement, you'd be producing slides, and that was how you convey your work. The interviewer will act like an inquisitive client. They'll ask lots of questions. How did you arrive at that conclusion? Why do you believe that to be the case? What evidence do you have to support your ideas? And so they'll be, frankly, a little bit of a difficult client and challenge you on your process and your approach. This particular format, it doesn't occur all that often, but I do mention it just in case you get it. And part of the reason that doesn't occur as often is because it takes a lot more time on the interviewer's part. So to give you all that data, to give you time to write slides, that whole process might take an hour to 2 hours. Firms typically only want to devote about 30 to 40 minutes per case interview. So having a 1 or 2 hour interview, it takes up a lot of resource and is very time consuming on their part. So it's a less popular format, but I mention it so you aren't surprised. And as you might imagine, the part they're trying to emphasize a bit more in the other formats is your ability to deliver a presentation and reference slides. So that's just something to keep in mind. So what I thought I'd do now is provide you with some examples of what types of case interview questions you might get. And the types of case interview questions you might get, guess what? Happens to mirror the types of client engagements that consulting firms get. Surprise, surprise. So there is a reason for everything consulting firms do in the interview process. And that reason is clients expect the firms to do the exact same thing in the client engagement and client service process. So sort of 8 broad categories that are fairly common. The first is profitability. Hey, we're losing money. Help us, right? That happens quite a bit. Second is growth or growth strategy. Hey, we want to grow our sales. Can you help us do that? Third is pricing. We're thinking about changing our prices. Should we or should we not? And if so, how? Fourth is new product creation. We're thinking of creating a new product. Is this a good idea? Yes or no? Fifth is we're trying to take an existing product and enter a new market and sell to a kind of customer we haven't served before. Is that a good idea? Should we do it or not? The sixth type is a mergers and acquisition case. Hey, we're thinking about buying this company or merging with one of our competitors. Would this be a good idea for us? Seventh is some kind of competition-based case interview. Hey, we have this new kind of competitor that we didn't realize we had before, a new entrant, if you would. What should we do about it? And then 8 is we have this other category, which is sort of a catch-all for anything else you might get. But I would say the first 7 are probably 80 to 90%, if not more, of the cases that you will see. So this concludes my overview of what is a case interview. As you might imagine, this topic is very deep and also quite broad. So there's a lot more to learn around case interviews. So I'm going to give you 2 resources for how you can learn more about the case interview and in more detail. The first is to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking the button below this particular video. You'll get notified when I create new videos. The second resource I want to provide is to visit my website at caseinterview.com. At caseinterview.com, you'll be able to download PDF handouts or cheat sheets for how to handle and approach the most common types of cases using something called case frameworks. You also see additional videos that have video demonstrations of the various types of cases and how to handle them. And you'll have an entire selection of additional case interview preparation resources, hundreds of articles on various aspects of the case interview process and how to interview with specific firms. So be sure to visit caseinterview.com. And finally, please add a comment to this particular video. If you have a question or you found something helpful or you want me to clarify something, simply leave a comment and I will post a reply when I get a chance. Thanks and have a great day. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel and to visit caseinterview.com. Thanks everyone. Have a great day.